Hey everyone, welcome to our lesson on surveys, experiments, and observational studies. We're going to take a look at the difference among these three things, and then we're going to practice identifying scenarios and categorizing them to figure out which type they are. So let's take a look at surveys first. A survey is going to take a sample of people and gather results on a topic of interest and then apply that to a population. So those are helpful when we're trying to find out something about a population, but we can't get to everyone in the whole population, so we take a survey of maybe a smaller sample of people. Some things that may happen when you're dealing with a survey that could cause some error. Some terms that may come up are this term bias. You want to try to avoid bias in your survey, and I put a little example here. If you're asking a question on a survey, you want to try to make it so that there is not any bias in the question, meaning it doesn't lead someone to answer a certain way over another. And here's an example of something you might see. If you wanted to know if your town is in favor of a tax for improving roads, you could simply ask, are you in favor of the new tax for road improvement? Or you could ask the question in a different way to try to get your response to be a certain way from your viewers. You could say, are you in favor of a tax which would greatly improve our terrible roads in the town? And you can see we've added some words in there to try to get them to answer a certain way, and that's called bias in your questions. You could also have what's called the interviewer effect. Sometimes when you are going through an interview, it can be a little scary, intimidating, and it might cause your people being interviewed to answer a certain way just because they're embarrassed about the type of question or the sensitive nature. So you could have what's called the interviewer effect, and that causes a little bit of error in the response. You could also have non-response, which is simply people don't participate in the survey, or they don't respond, don't send back the flyers of the questions you're asking about. So those are some things that come up when you're dealing with surveys. Okay, let's talk about experiments. An experiment is actually going to be imposing a treatment and then collecting data on the effects of that treatment. So you'll have, notice here down, one type of experiment is called a randomized comparative experiment. So you'll actually divide, maybe groups into two groups, and you'll impose the treatment on one group, called the treatment group here, and you'll just keep all the other factors the same for the other group so that you'll have a group to compare to. In the end, that's called the control group. You have to do that to see if what you're imposing is actually the thing that's causing a change. Okay? All right, and then we have observational studies where we're simply observing something that's happening or observing results. Focusing on observing a factor to see if it's related to a characteristic of interest. So, for instance, if you're trying to figure out if two things have a relationship with one another, you may use an observational study and just record some details about that. So we'll see an example of an observational study in just a minute so you can see what that looks like. So examples of each one. So we sort of talked about what these are. Now let's look at an example. So a survey would be if I was going to poll a group of students to find out how many hours of sleep they get each night. So I just would put the question on a piece of paper or an electronic survey and have them answer about that. And I would gather data that way. An observational study would be if I wanted to know if there was any relationship between alcohol and blood pressure. So I might simply ask a group of people, a sample of people, something about how many ounces of alcohol they consume and whether or not they suffer from high blood pressure, low blood pressure. And what that would be is I'm trying to figure out, I'm not imposing any treatment on them, I'm not separating them into groups and giving one group a certain amount and not the other. I'm just simply recording results of what they tell me, whether or not they consume and whether or not they suffer from high blood pressure, because I'm trying to find out here if there's a relationship between the two things. So consuming alcohol would be the incidence, And if most of those people suffered from high blood pressure, that would be a characteristic of interest for me to pursue further, see if there's some relationship there. Continuing examples, let's see an experiment. So the difference here is I'm going to be separating into groups and imposing a treatment on one group. So here's an example. In a population of people suffering from colds, I would split one group of people away from another, and I would have one group take a vitamin C pill each day, and the other group would not be taking that pill. And then at the end of the week or the month that I was doing this trial, I would see if I would record the duration of their colds and see if maybe there was a relationship between the vitamin C and the duration of their colds. And I'm doing the splitting of the groups, and I'm assigning who's taking the pill, so this is an experiment. I've got a treatment group and a control group. Okay, so let's see if we can identify, just knowing what they are, seeing an example of each one. Let's see if we can identify what type we're dealing with here. So, would you say observational study or experiment to the following? Let's take a look. Number 1, the student council records the number of chicken fingers purchased by students in the lunch line. So we're watching students go through the lunch line, and we're simply writing down on our checklist how many chicken fingers they're buying out of this line. We are not separating into groups. We're not imposing a treatment. We're not having them, we're not putting a certain factor on one group or another. So we will say that this one is simply an observational study. We're observing and recording. All right, number 2. The student council gives one class of students chocolate before a test and does not give any to a different class. And after the test, they record the test scores. So we can see here we're definitely splitting into groups. We're imposing a treatment on one class and not on the other, so that we have something to compare to. That is definitely going to be an experiment. We're just simply seeing if that may have an effect. And of course, we know there may be other factors that come into play on their test scores, but this is definitely an experiment since we're dividing into groups and imposing a treatment. So this concludes our lesson on surveys, experiments, and observational studies.